So I'd like to start by thanking the organizers of Fast Forward and the Tate Modern for inviting me to this very exciting conference. I was privileged to know Homai Vyarawalla, who was arguably India's first woman press photographer, intimately for 15 years as her biographer. And Homai passed away after celebrating her 98th birthday in 2012. And her archive of over 100,000 negatives and prints was given on permanent loan 2 years before she died to the Al-Qazi collection of photography, which is one of the largest private archives of photography in India, or rather in South Asia. In this presentation, I'd like to revisit and reflect on the many lives of the photographer by unpacking shifts in my own scholarship on her work and the possibilities that have opened up with digitization. I would like to explore what it means to be lost in a digital plenitude without the stability of the communicative memory of the photographer, and how this might be a productive endeavor. But first, the biographical details, and I'm going to go fairly quickly over that. Homai Vyarawalla photographed for over 3 decades from the late 1930s. She stopped photographing in 1970. This was a very significant part of Indian history that spanned the last years of the British Empire, the turbulence of independence and partition, and years of nation building. Growing up in Bombay, Homai learned photography from her boyfriend, whom she later married. This marks the first phase of her work as she documented street life in Bombay during the Second World War. Most of this was commissioned and was printed in illustrated magazines. In 1942, the couple moved to Delhi to join the publicity wing of the British war effort, and after independence, they continued to work for the British High Commission. The relocation to Delhi changed the nature of her photography forever, catapulting Homai into the world of mainstream nationalist politics. Her new job profile required her to cover major events and significant people, and I'm going to quickly run you through some of her iconic pictures that have circulated widely after her rediscovery in the early 1990s, the events around independence, and partition, that's politicians raising their hands in favor of the partition of India. The funeral of Gandhi, that's crowds running with the train carrying his ashes for immersion after his death. Her most camera-friendly subject, Prime Minister Nehru. The building of dams and steel projects, basically nation building, and public personalities who visited India during this time, in this case Queen Elizabeth in 1962 and the Dalai Lama in 1956. And while her days were spent photographing political events, Homai inhabited a completely different world in the evenings. These images of parties and dances and hunts represent a glimpse into a small but elite subculture of expatriate life in the city. She also took scores of pictures of ordinary Indians as well as street life and architecture, and I'll get into that a little later. Now, Homai gave up photography in 1970 after the death of her partner, and after being a professional working woman for 33 years, she slipped with absolute ease one day to set up home for her only child, who now had a job in a university town. She was forgotten for 23 years till a photographer located a Mrs. Homai Vyarawalla in a list of photographers and organized a major exhibition of her work in 1993. I met Homai in 1997, which also happened to be a commemorative year in India because it marked 50 years of Indian independence. Homai's photographs of important political events were suddenly famous again, as they were printed up in every illustrated magazine. There was also the novelty of rediscovering Homai as a pioneering woman photographer, and I would see some of my early work on her as being driven by the imperative to reconstruct a history of firsts, of her lens of looking at the world, her place as a woman in a public arena dominated by men, which was politics, and her relationship with technology. I made a film on her, which was the beginning of a long association with Homai that would culminate in a book. As I got to know her better, I realized that her engagement with technology was not just limited to the camera. Homai had always developed and printed her own pictures. She also built her own furniture, stitched her own clothes, did electrical and plumbing repairs, drove a car, and created nifty household gadgets. And incidentally, that is a chest of drawers with her tools, where she also stored her negative jackets in the upper drawers. She often said that she was like Robinson Crusoe. Her island was her home in Baroda, where she lived independently till the last with her plants and a few personal photographs. Now, these are images of these are pictures of her images being packed to be taken to the Alkazi archives in Delhi in 2010. This was followed by a major retrospective of her work at the National Gallery of Modern Art in 3 Indian cities, which I curated, and Homai traveled to each venue. But one of the interesting outcomes of the shows was that they reintroduced Homai Vyarawalla to some of her own photographs that she had not viewed for over half a century. By now, we had started to digitize, and this was opening up the archive in unexpected directions. As the exhibition traveled from Delhi to Bombay and then to Bangalore, the space given to what Homai called her important pictures, photographs basically of iconic political events, shrunk, and other portraits of everyday life and ordinary moments took precedence. For instance, here are some quieter and more reflective photographs of urban space and architecture in Bombay in the late 1930s. In 2012, Homai Vyarawalla passed away, and I will now discuss new work that has emerged from the archive after her death. These photographs taken at the interstices of her more public frames have been the focus of another show that I am curating. The pictures seem to suggest that Homai Vyarawalla was observing other worlds keenly that included the inner and outer lives, particularly of young women like herself. They also suggest that the move to Delhi and the need to represent famous people and important events may have diverted her gaze away from other more ordinary representations of everyday life. Opening up the archive for digitization meant that one was now looking at the entire negative jacket, and you have to remember that in Homai's case, this negative jacket meant 100 negs. So each negative jacket was a little leather jacket which had about 100 negs. One was looking at images taken before and after what may have been printed up, and one was looking at what Homai may never have chosen to print up. In the discipline of film, we call these the outtakes. I also found myself revisiting pictures that I had used in my book 9 years ago. Let me take the example of her photographs taken in Bombay of utility services during World War II. These pictures of medical aid or essential communications had appeared in my book as war propaganda. I now began to look at the outtakes of these pictures as a keen documentation of an analog world of technology and infrastructure. Curiously performative, there were moments when the actors in these frames had a more spontaneous and playful engagement with the photographer. I also started to revisit the many pictures of costume and fashion shows by elite women in Delhi. The idea was to explore what might change if Nehruvian India, a period mostly defined through post-independence politics, were to be viewed through the lens of women's fashion or other forms of masquerade. Here are some of these pictures that seem to be in conversation with global cinema and fashion. Of course, the imprint of Nehru is strong. You can see that in these clothes worn by this expatriate woman and her children. But Nehruvian India is also a kaleidoscope of competing aspirations where national and personal desires collide. In my book, I had referred to Brides of India and Costumes of India pageants as markers of early nationalist discourses. These competitions were often set against the backdrop of a map of India. You can see that in these photographs. And the Prime Minister Nehru had coined a popular term to describe this idea. He called it unity in diversity. But looking at the heterogeneity of actors who performed being Indian in these pictures, one could well ask, what does it mean? What did it mean to be an Indian? What is Indianness? Can outsiders merely masquerade as Indians, or do they also constitute the idea of being Indian? Here is another surprise that emerged from an unseen negative jacket of another kind of masquerade by a theater artist in the 1940s, as he impersonates a woman. Digitization prompted me to look again at Homai's photographs of 2 educational institutions in the early and mid-1940s. These are photographs of students at the Sir J.J. School of Arts in Bombay, which is one of the oldest colonial art schools in the country, and Lady Irwin College. Now, Lady Irwin College was founded in 1932, and it was the first institution in Delhi to teach home science, where young women were groomed to be efficient homemakers. In my book, these pictures were framed within what I now see as a very limited feminist reading because of what I then saw as the emphasis on the home and domesticity. Now, when I viewed these pictures endlessly in still digital thumbnails, the young women seemed to be like actors who performed the roles of homemakers as the sets kept changing in practice cottages that simulated the home. So if you look very carefully, these tableaus are actually set in the same room. Digital scans of the complete negative jackets reveal that Homai's interactions with young women like herself produced other kinds of performative pictures. In a completely different context of politics in the Middle East, the Israeli scholar Ariella Azoulay has made a distinction between the photographed event and the event of photography. She suggests that the event of photography is a more dynamic occurrence that carries on long after the photograph has been taken. To my mind, the event of photography would include the synergy, the chemistry, a relationship of affect that happens because of the interaction of the female photographer, her subjects, and the space they found themselves in because of the presence of the camera. You see that here as the young women pose for the camera in more playful and collaborative ways once she has taken pictures of them at work. Now, when I was putting this selection together, I was reminded of an incident more than a decade ago when an elderly Parsi woman walked up to this picture in an exhibition in Calcutta. She identified herself in the picture, but her memories tied to this picture were not about learning the skills of air raid precaution during the Second World War, which is what this picture is all about. Instead, it was to do with the memory of fun and bonding with the other women as they performed these mock rehearsals for war. Looking at the entire set of pictures, there seem to be other narratives emerging about desire, leisure, play, and a quest to be modern. This brings me to another body of work on the emergence globally of the phenomenon of the modern girl. A consortium of researchers across the world have suggested that the modern girl image was a global construction of transnational companies and their advertising strategies in the 1920s and 1930s. These researchers argue that technologies of the self, such as lipsticks, face creams, skin lighteners, cigarettes, high heels, and fashionable clothes, literally changed bodies as they enabled women to cross over from inner to outer worlds. Appearing before and being seen by the camera could be seen as a modern act. As public women, film stars may have been the most modern of girls, but the most visible representation of the modern girl in India was the urban collegiate young woman. This was particularly true for the Anglo-Indian and Parsi communities in India, which were considered to be more liberal as far as women were concerned. If fashion was one of the markers of the modern girl, travel, mobility, and work were others. This pair of pictures features women travelers at the dockyard in Bombay. They seem slightly out of place, as if they do not belong. The women look like they could be Anglo-Indian. With the arrival of independence in 1947, this community was increasingly threatened as they were considered outsiders by both the Indians and the British. Despite the mobility that these meme subs seemed to have then, the photos have a poignancy because they also suggest their isolation and vulnerability. A striking young woman dominates many of Homai's photographs at the art school. This was Rehana Mughal, a classmate, and she plays different roles in the photographs. We see her in one of Homai's earliest pictures taken in 1937 as she poses like a diva at a girls' picnic. In one of Homai's more famous photographs, she chips away at a sculpture in a workshop along with another classmate. The image is a powerful one as it reverses the traditional expectations of who gazes at whom in art. Now, it has been argued that the potentially transgressive and fashionable modern girl was edged out by the imperatives of cultural nationalism in India. Others suggest that modern girls have been part of every era and that women didn't ever stop being modern. They only had to perform to be good girls when required historically. And perhaps this picture will illustrate what I mean, where Rehana poses with her head covered demurely in a sari on a cover. This hand-colored picture published in 1941 is titled A Silent Tear, but despite the prominent teardrop beneath her eye and her pensive expression, it's hard to miss the fashionable crinkled hair under the covered head, the Georgette sari, and Rehana's lipstick, which are all the accoutrements of the modern girl. In an interesting parallel, the same was happening with Homai Vyarawalla's own appearance as she relocated to Delhi too. By 1942, Homai was a mother. Surrounded by much greater scrutiny, Homai's survival in an arena dominated by men depended upon a stripping away of a more obvious sexual presence. She now welcomed the nickname Mummy given to her by one of her colleagues as it placed her on a pedestal. She deliberately cultivated a morally correct persona at work and dressed in a khadi sari. Her sari provided her with a safe alibi to live a more conventional outer life. It enabled Homai to travel and spend her evenings unescorted. Performing a certain kind of femininity was integral to Homai Vyarawalla's professional survival as a press photographer at the time. So what changes with my new work on Homai Vyarawalla? The most significant change is the lack of her physical presence. For over 15 years, I have been tied to the work by Homai's memory of these pictures. But memory, as Annette Kuhn and others have pointed out, is an unstable thing, mediated by hindsight, by selective remembering, and by amnesia. During my many conversations with Homai, I was always struck by the sharpness of her memory, which never deviated from the plot. The facts never changed, and neither did the way in which she recounted a narrative. Today, I look back at this almost rehearsed quality of her responses as a performance. This is understandable, given the many times that she had probably been asked the same questions. I am returning now to some of her audio tape responses to my questions to listen more attentively to what Kuhn describes as a staging of memory, for pauses, for annotations, for emotion, for what seemed then to be unrelated information, to look for gaps. For instance, there is a curious absence in Homai's work, which is a partition. While she did not shoot the refugees or document any of the violence, it is interesting to see what she did shoot during this time. I suggest that there could be other ways of looking at partition narratives in Homai's work, and that is through absence or what is concealed in her frames. This one, for instance, of Connaught Place in New Delhi, which is considered to be one of her most iconic pictures, masks a dark partition story of displacement and forced occupation. During the weeks and months of violence in Delhi, Homai and her husband would stand chatting on the terrace of their home in Connaught Place so that wandering mobs would not set fire to the shop of their landlord just below, who was Muslim. One night, a wealthy Hindu family arrived from Karachi and forcibly occupied the house. Her landlord's family had to leave for Pakistan. Homai often spoke about this picture taken a few years after partition with nostalgia for what could have been better times. The photograph could be seen to be haunted by the memory of that loss. While I miss Homai's physical presence and often find myself wondering why I did not ask her more, there is also a new kind of freedom to unmoor these pictures from context and to let them stand in new constellations. This brings me to the possibilities created by the digitization of her work that has enabled a forensic imagination and a closer reading of indexical detail, and liberation too, as the archive is reorganized and rearranged outside of context, allowing for other kinds of interrogations and connections, as I've pointed out with my earlier examples. As a last point, I'd like to draw attention to new lives of Homai's work, over which we would have little control. Digital culture creates new producers who reappropriate texts and refashion them in configurations that have little to do with authorial intention. For instance, Homai's pictures circulate on the internet today, speaking to floating, unofficial narratives. Here is a collage with many of Homai's photographs that indicts Nehru for his so-called interest in women, who, as you can see here, include a bewildering cast, which include just not Edwina Mountbatten, who he's rumored to have an affair with, but her daughter Pamela, Jackie Kennedy, Queen Elizabeth, the wife of the British High Commissioner, Mrs. Simon, and even Nehru's sister, Vijayalakshmi Pandit. So they're all there, and they're all Homai's photographs. So let me end my presentation by showing you a 3-minute clip from another shorter film that I made on her after her death. At the age of 94, Homai traveled abroad for the first and last time in her life. She went to the US and she came to London. And the clip has a short excerpt from one of the last interviews that she gave me before she died. And it also ends with a very short fragment of archival footage from the morning of August 15, 1947, where you will actually see her in that footage. Now, I find this brief indexical trace in this archival footage particularly interesting because it frames Homai Vyarawalla within mainstream nationalist history, because it was 15th August 1947, but it also draws attention to a marginalized agent in this history, the photographer who played a role in chronicling these events, and of another kind of modern girl with a camera, one who captured history through her photographs, but also created history by her presence. Thank you. I'm going to ask you to play the clip with sound.